The Iraq War 15 years on, the war has also left a lasting global impact. The toppling of Saddam Hussein led to a vacuum, eventually filled by the Islamic State. The rise of the extremist group has affected the global oil supply and security against terrorism in other countries. Take a look. In 2003, many European countries joined most members of the UN Security Council in opposing the US and UK decision to attack Iraq. The past 15 years, multilateral organizations besides the UN helped to discourage unilateralism and the unbridled pursuit of hegemony, some say. The G20, BRICS, and many other multilateral groups are increasingly influencing the international community. American unilateralism has needlessly antagonized some of its friends as it withdrew from the international pacts such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Paris Agreement in an effort to make America great again, a quote from someone. So what did the world learn from the Iraq War? Here is in Beijing, He Wenping once again with us. Meanwhile, we're also joined by Jonah Blank, who is a senior political scientist from RAND Cooperation in the United States. In London, the UK, we have Ian Begg, professorial research fellow at the European Institute of London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome to the three of you. I want to start with you, Professor Begg. How the war, the invasion itself, 20 days only, and the years of wars after that has been transforming the world order even in a way.
Yes, I think we can identify a number of things that have happened. One is that it changed the price dynamics of the oil industry quite fundamentally, because what you saw in parallel with the withdrawal of the Iraqi oil supply was the development of new oil resources elsewhere, and in particular in the US, which has moved from a significant net importer of oil to be a country which is on the cusp of being an exporter of crude oil, let alone refined oil products. And that lies behind the US disengagement, which is a second consequence of the Iraq war. We have, in the interim, we've seen the disappointment of the Arab Spring, not really getting anywhere very much, and we have the new security and terror threats, which have in some ways been motivated by the Iraq war. You mentioned in the introduction the rise of ISIL. That can be traced directly to the demise of Saddam Hussein, who, for all his faults, at least kept a lid on that form of terrorism.
Now we are seeing, Mr. Blank, the America looking much more, shall we say, internally than to the rest of the world. Many say it is something that happened after the war in Iraq, a disillusion that the country has, particularly the people in the country has, about the rest of the world. Your say?
Yes. I think one of the most important things is to be clear-eyed about the past so that we don't make the same mistakes again. Before the war, America was bitterly divided about the wisdom of getting involved. Even though many Americans, including Mr. Trump, are on record of having supported the war beforehand, we've got to remember that a majority of the Democratic members of Congress voted against it. Why does this matter? Because in 2003, the American people were led, I think, in a wrong direction that has had very bad consequences for the world, and we now have got to make sure we don't repeat these mistakes.
The trust of government, of course, is a big issue. I remember 15 years ago covering that war from the U.S. Capitol, the big debate and the enormous amount of demonstrations going on in the street every day about war or not to have a war. But having said that, though, 15 years already, Ms. He here in Beijing, this is America that has been changing since then. This is also the world since then have been looking at America in a very different way. Ms. He, how is it having an impact on what we are having today when it comes to world order, or when it comes to how the world should be run and how the international community should work together? Ms. He.
Yeah, for the world order, I think after the end of the Cold War, and also even after the end of Second World War, with this UN has been established, and then the 5 principles, those coexistence of those 5 principles has been written in those UN Charter to guiding how to keep this world order, how to, protect the countries, no matter it's big or small, strong or weak, and protect their sovereignty. I think those principles has been, unfortunately, has been attacked. I will not say has been destroyed completely, but has been attacked heavily by this Iraqi war. So nowadays, even without any a green light coming from the UN, that means the UN authority has been marginalized, and also without even taking into consideration of all other big powers, their opinion, we know the France, like Germany, are also against the war, and then U.S. just go ahead and then to destroy a regime by the force. Even without finding any evidence they have been saying so.
Right.
So this is a very bad example.
The division among the allies. The United States looking much more inward, even now saying making America great again or America first. And the rising of different voices, particularly from emerging and developing countries such as China and some of the other countries. Professor Begg, what would all of this mean in a way? How is this, from your perspective, is really shaping the world for the near future?
Well, I think it's a very fluid position. The Europeans have struggled to adopt a coherent position vis-à-vis the rest of the world. And it's important to recognize in talking about the 15 years since the Iraq War that we had this major economic crisis in the developed countries as well, which has shaped opinions. It's led to a reluctance on the part of the Europeans to think outside their own borders. We know that Iran has been, if anything, pretty consistent in its approach. Turkey has become more assertive, so you've seen the rise of a new position from the Turks. All of this is shaping the Middle East and the wider context. And I would stress yet again the dynamics of that oil industry, which is pulling the economics in a different direction from what we saw as long ago as 15 years ago. Plus, you said you were covering the events in Washington then. Don't forget that was only 2 years beyond 9/11, or even 18 months beyond 9/11.
Exactly. So, Mr. Blank, here's the thing. You got a lot of regional changes, the allies of the United States in the Middle East. That seems to have a big impact on what we are having today in that region. You also have the American public getting ever more disillusioned about its own government and the decision made by the government, which led to the Obama administration 2 terms, and then people get disillusioned once again, and which led to the rise of Donald Trump as an alternative. And now look at where we are today. So do you think we can really learn the lesson, or things are getting ever worse? Mr. Blank.
I don't think it's a straight line. I think that the Bush administration made a terrible error in going into Iraq, and I think members of both parties, Democrats and Republicans alike, generally accept that now. However, in 2008, the American people elected President Obama, who had opposed the war in Iraq beforehand, and who brought in a very different vision, one that really put America back into the world in an engaged way, treating our allies, our friends with respect, and trying to come to terms with those who might not necessarily be our friends and allies. I think that course could be the course for America again.
Could be. Very interesting, that word. We will remember that. Yeah, we got it. And
yes.
Ms. He also, as the other 2 guests, one said could be, the other said fluid, the situation. So what's going to be the role for emerging economies? For China, for example, which is now trying to streamline itself when it comes to internal development and its external role. Ms. He.
Well, I think China's foreign policy has been very clear and insisted on from the beginning now, even until now. That is, you should use all those diplomatic means trying to resolve all those diplomatic issues. And even though if any use of the force were necessary to use, we have to go through the UN, get this UN Security Council's permission. So we will respect these international organizations, their authority, cannot put the UN at a marginal place. And if all those big power, they just go ahead with their own wish, that will take the international relation. Those norms, I think, is in danger, because those norms has been accumulated, those wisdom from all those countries during the past. So this is a very important thing, lesson we should learn.
All right, we only have about 2 minutes left. I want to have 30 seconds thoughts from every one of you. Biggest takeaway from this disaster, which has taken more than 15 years. What is it? Let's go to Mr. Blank first.
Yes, thank you. I think that the tragedy of the Iraq War is that this was utterly predictable. Anyone looking at the evidence beforehand knew that this was a war of choice and knew that there was not a long-term strategy to put the pieces back together. The real tragedy will be if we in the United States and if the world community don't learn from this error and avoid making similar blunders in the Middle East and elsewhere around the world.
Ms. He, 30 seconds for you as well.
Yeah, I think the lessons are many too. One is should be very careful to use the force. So second is, if the force has been used, and they should be very careful to to dissolve all those existing powers and the authority. So have to put the society in the order and have to take into consideration of all the local conditions.
Mr. Begg, before we go, final words from you, 30 seconds. Thank you.
Well, the first thing to say is that the lesson from the Iraq War is that it wasn't the war itself that was a major problem. It was the failure to anticipate what would happen subsequently. The reconstruction of Iraq was a much bigger failure than the war, which in military terms was a success. Second, I would say that there is a legacy of turmoil in the Middle East, which is not going to go away for a long time. And the third is we need to look at the economics of all of this. I mentioned the oil previously. China's role in the Middle East is an economic power, not really a security or foreign policy power. And China may need to think further on where it goes next.
We heard the siren sound in the backdrop, Mr. Begg. We can hear the world is still in a place that is urgently need to be addressed. Many of the issues, including this war in Iraq, which is based on false allegations. And that is all the time we have for today. Well, I want to thank the three of you for being with us, He Wenping, Jonah Blank, and Ian Begg. Really appreciate it.